So, so welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for sitting down with me. So first, can you just state your name and where you currently live?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Snyder, and I live in Springfield, Oregon.
Okay. And where were you born and in what year?
I was born in California in 1951.
Oh, gosh. We're
51.
we're the same age.
Yay.
Yeah,
It's not so bad.
I'm December.
December. Wow. Yeah.
So I wanted to have you walk through your occupational history. So can you tell, and I know we're going to focus on you being a caregiver, but I know you've done some things before that. So could you talk a little bit about your work before you became a caregiver?
Sure. The first job I had that lasted for any appreciable time and actually supported me was as being a typesetter. And this was in another state early on. And that was an industry that was undergoing extreme change due to new technology. But when I came in, I was working with people who had been working in the industry for 40, 50 years and been through all that change. And it fascinated me that I could walk in and make the same amount of money, and most of the people were men, and they had wives who also worked, or some didn't work, and they had 2 homes and children in college. And I was making the same pay because this industry had been unionized for over 100 years. And it was an amazing experience. So I got to work in that industry in different settings, in different cities, finally ending up in Eugene, working at the Register Guard as a typesetter. And I loved it. But then the industry fell out from under me, but I loved it.
And when you say you loved it, what did you love about it?
Well, my mother had told me when I was in high school to learn how to type because my husband might leave me and I'd have to support myself. Well, little did I know that when I was in college and I needed to type out a piece of homework, and I found the local college newspaper open, and the fella said, yeah, you can type, you can use our typewriter. And he was sleeping there, and he woke up and sat up and said, wow, you type fast. Do you want a job? And so I got into the field that way. And at the time I could get any number of jobs. If I needed a raise, I could go and find another place to work there. Did you ask me what did I like about it?
And you mentioned you used the word love, so I was just curious
Love.
if you could talk about what you loved about typesetting.
I loved that it was actually a skill I could do. And then when I saw how important it was and how connected, like I said, with over 100 years of skilled people putting out newspapers and books, and what it took to do that, what was required, knowing the spacing, paying attention to the spacing of letters, the size of letters, how many letters on a page. I mean, it was just a lot of detail and it took a lot of skill. So my little skill of being able to type transitioned me into working with people who had gone through apprenticeships and just years of amazing. They're amazing people, and operating machinery that was as big as a whatever, those big computers, but hot lead, cold type, all this stuff, this transition in technology. I got to witness not all of the transition, but the workers' perspective of it, because they would talk about, one fellow learned how to judge the right temperature of molten lead so we could pour it into a cardboard mold so that the wire photos could be printed. He could judge that temperature by putting a raw potato in the pot.
Wow.
So I love being able to connect with that that history and the people who were currently in my life who had been through that, and now we're doing the same thing I was doing. So we were all in it together, and so I loved it.
And how did you then get into caregiving? Because that's something you've done, you mentioned, for about the last 10 or so years.
Yeah, well, I started out taking care of a loved one who became dependent and had no other resources, and so and we lived together, and so the state of Oregon said, well, we can pay you some money to take care of her, and we'll call you an adult foster home. And so I started doing that, and for about 5 years. And in the meantime, I started to seek out other people who were doing this work because it was very isolating. And I didn't know what I had gotten into. There was too much I didn't know. So I started a little group called the Caregivers Group and publicized it, and met some other people along the way. And then I transitioned into actually being a home care worker and hired um, uh, it was through the senior services offices that they kind of would call me if they had somebody who needed that work. And so I did that for a few years. And that was about the beginning of when the union SEIU had organized the home care workers, and having had the wonderful experience of unionized work in the printing industry, I was very interested to see what was going on there. And it didn't take too long, actually. They hired me to help continue organizing caregivers of all types. And I got to do that basically until it was time for me to retire. So in that process, I had met people who provided care in their homes, who went to other people's homes, who had group homes or adult foster homes, caring for people either with developmental or physical disabilities and seniors. And found myself immediately upon retiring being hired to work for my great niece, who as an adult woman has developmental disabilities and had lived with her mother, my niece, and all her life. But their family supports passed on, and they were left pretty destitute. And my partner at the time, they were her family, and she said, we've got to take care of them. And okay, let's do it. We discovered they needed to live with us, and we didn't have an appropriate house. And we found the most wonderful home in Springfield. And it's turned out to be very appropriate. So I got into it that way, and it was nothing like I thought it was.
Talk a little bit, well, let me ask you this first. How do you learn to be a caregiver? Was this something you had any experience with before, with family or other people, or is this something you were called on to do and then had to begin a whole learning process yourself? Did you get formal training along the way, more on the job? Just how did your knowledge about caregiving develop and evolve?
Well, yeah, that's a key question, really. Caregiving is something I thought, of course, I know how to do everything. I can clean up somebody's mess. I can cook. I can clean the house. What's involved in caregiving. So, getting into it that way, you find out, like I said, in my early experience, it was isolating, and I didn't understand about medicine. And I didn't understand about, well, there was a lot I didn't understand. I found difficult, and I just tried to go by, somebody says they need your help. That's easy to do. But when somebody needs your help and they're not asking you, it's a little bit more difficult to figure out how to provide that help. So for just figuring things out on my own, that's the process. But our union had started some trainings for people, and I had been involved in how those operated and what was available, and I took a few of those trainings, and they helped. So that was uh, key, really, to be able to feel yourself getting trained and hear from someone, this is how you do something, and you go, well, of course. But then it's a good way to remember when you're in the moment of kind of freaking out. You can say, oh yeah, this is how you do it. So bathing or um, communication, things like that. So beyond that, in my particular situation, we were actually three people taking care of her,
Mm.
and uh, they, being family members, had their ideas of what was needed, of what she was indicating, how to communicate. So that was my learning curve early in the process, and I went through being able to observe, but then if I wanted it my way, having to figure out, well, I don't really like the way they're asking her that question. I'm going to ask her this way.
Mm.
I'm very verbose, and that doesn't always work with people who have developmental or intellectual disabilities. But in a lot of ways, I've found my own way for communication. So the on the job is, I think, real key to caregiving. Especially when someone comes into a person's home, every person's home is different, and every person they work with is different, and they have to go through that process of kind of getting your feet solid on the ground. And that was true for family caregiving for me as well.
Mhm. Are there any special qualities you think a caregiver needs, or just particular types of traits or attributes that are important, or maybe in your view even essential to being a good caregiver?
Well, you really like to put me on the spot, Bob. I always try not to tell people what to do or what to think, but I got to reflect preparing for this interview, and one of the things how I would summarize a family caregiver really is, you go through a process of thinking you know how to do everything, um, thinking you're in control, and then losing control not only of your own life, but of what you're doing, and trying to regain that control, you have to get to a point of being humble. You have to uh, be willing to consider that you're not right about things, that you have to find out what is correct to do, or in what you're doing. Um, and especially if you're a family caregiver, I think with other family members around, you really have to give up a sense of I'm right, and they're not right, and the conflict that can ensue when you have that. And I wrote something down as well. Uh, I think a person has to let go of that idea that they're right about everything, but at the same time, they have to take control over a situation.
Mm.
And even if your family member doesn't want you to. And that's when being able to observe professional caregivers, whether in the hospital or medical setting, or having other caregivers who aren't related to the family come in and seeing how they operate, it really helps in your learning curve to be able to be a little bit more distant and just approach the family member as you see strangers approaching that person.
Mm, mhm. Uh, Some, there are people, scholars in the field who talk about caregiving, and they sometimes use a term, I suspect you have probably heard of it, emotional labor. That,
I
that
hadn't really heard it, no.
Oh, well, they use this term emotional labor to say that in caregiving, there's just a lot of, and it's not to say that all occupations don't have some element of it, but here you're caring for a person who's vulnerable at some level. I gather lots of ups and downs, or every day can be different. There are curveballs. There's all kinds of things that happen that can take an emotional toll, or at least there's an emotional part of it that maybe is present more perhaps in caregiving than in some other occupations. So I would want to just ask you how you respond to that idea about the emotions that get invested in this type of work as you've done it.
Well, I'm glad people are talking about that for sure. Uh, it's exactly true. You're on an emotional roller coaster sometimes, and so are the people around you. Um, and I mentioned my other two types of work. I was emotionally invested in those types. I loved one of them, right? And I was out talking to lots of people in the other one. And there were emotional responses that I had, and they largely revolved around um, how people were responding to me. Maybe that's fair. I'm not sure, but or what people were giving me. And in this case, the emotional toll is it's like witnessing death. Maybe it's like witnessing death uh, too often, um, because you're witnessing a person's frailty or limitations, and the well, I don't know really what the process is I have gone through, but uh, I know that all the feelings of fear, anger, uh, loneliness, despair, they all start playing around with you.
Mm, mhm.
And the guiding light, or if you're deep in this well, you just see the bucket, rope comes down, you're going to grab that bucket. That bucket is the person who you're caring for, their response, and seeing them respond in a way that gives you a sense they are okay. They're uh, they're doing fine. They're safe. They know they're safe. Um, their needs are taken care of, and they know it. So that's my response to your question.
Sure, sure. And if you were to, can you talk a little bit, just, I know that every day is probably a bit different as a caregiver, but just in terms of the actual work you do, could you just describe some of the, actual functions and things you do in your work as a caregiver? I mean, just the actual tasks that you are
Yeah.
called on to perform. I'm sure not everyone every day, but just if you think about it as a kind of a whole, what are some of the actual tasks that a caregiver performs or you performed?
Yeah, great. So I did, okay, so I might read a little bit here. But on a typical day, it's like any other job that I've done, really. I have an idea and a plan for how the day is going to go, and it sometimes goes that way and sometimes it doesn't. But what I do in my job, I make plans for activities that my great niece can do and wants to do. Um, and I plan meals, things like what she might be wearing. So I get her up, uh, have coffee with her, make sure that she has, whether it's a notebook she likes to write in or a video game she likes to play, make sure she has those around and give her time to wake up. And then bathe and dress her. And sometimes I do her laundry and clean her room. Um, and sometimes gets involved in doing that as well, folding clothes or putting things up. And I've discovered that that is an activity that she actually does enjoy doing. So that's kind of an example of how you can learn just by doing what you have to do. Then you learn that it can really meet the needs of the person as well. Make her meals, find an activity to do. Uh, that has been a real challenge in this day-to-day caregiving because we didn't know what resources were available for someone like her to get involved with her peers. But she really needed to have some social interaction. So we started taking her to Saturday market and just observing how she responded. And uh, now we've got her in some programs like in a bowling league. And so we have certain things that we can she can look forward to. And then sometimes I work 12 hours or more in a day and you know, getting her to bed. And so it's pretty much that, but it's repetitive and yet can change day to day depending on things. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And what if, let me ask you a kind of a two-sided question. What would you say is most challenging then in being a caregiver? And on the flip side of that, what are the things about it that you found most satisfying?
So most challenging really is for me, it's been communication, learning new communication skills, and being creative, trying to think of finding resources that I've never gotten involved in doing that, sometimes like that. Um, Using the computer has been challenging because the state has changed how we keep our time and uh, but and then the family aspects have been challenging, like I think I mentioned, but who's doing what when sometimes is uh, the the conundrum uh, and so starting and stopping, keeping track of the time that you're responsible for is challenging. And on the flip side, I would say it seems to me my other family members feel this way, but I know I feel this is the most satisfying situation I've had in my life,
Mm,
where I'm witnessing myself and other people kind of living um, our best lives. And I I sometimes say to myself, well, I'm retired. I should have total control over my time and be able to just take care of myself, all these things I never really did for myself. But it all works out. And in overall, I am the happiest I've been in my life.
mm,
And I feel I don't have control a lot of times, but looking back, it doesn't matter because it all works out.
mm, mm.
So,
And what, can you be more specific, Jen, just about what is it that makes you so happy as far as doing this work?
frankly, it's watching the growth that we're all going through. It's being a part of, uh, um, an intimate part, and looking back, each of us has, well, myself. I'll just talk about myself. Um, and 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 what makes me so happy? It's watching the results. It's well, it not unsimilar to watching the daily newspaper come off the press and seeing the beautiful ad I did or the
Mm,
wonderful job I did on it, right? Seeing that out, seeing that completed. But in this situation, uh, what I mentioned before, it's seeing that someone is actually comfortable in their home, safe, interested or not interested in what's going on, able to get up and go around and be interested, willing to be taken and escorted and get involved in other situations. Um, knowing that that person had to learn the sense of safety and had to experience, and that that sense of safety in part I helped to create. That, and then I'm feeling safe in the situation too, so
yeah,
that makes me happy.
yeah, yeah. And what has it meant having a union or being involved in a union, and how has that affected and shaped your work?
Well, it's been very important. um the union has helped the state to define our work and to give it credibility, give it respect. Um, having the union means that we have been able to increase our wages and benefits over time. Would never be able to do that just one on one, being and the the overall boss is the state. And how does an individual caregiver whose time is so consumed by the work um, get an increase in wages or get some benefits? So the union for us has made that all possible. And the other part of that is it's made it possible by caregivers like me getting involved and participating in all the steps that are required for better wages and educating the people in the state who have all this power and all of that stuff. And those people I can talk to, I can get to know. um so uh and we have really good benefits. We have paid health care, and we get we can take time off and be paid for it, and we get training. So the training programs have improved and improved and gotten a lot more specific to our type of caregiving versus the seniors and people with physical disabilities. It is a different experience, of course, but I think that's pretty much it.
Mhm. Yeah. So do you then not, most workers have a boss, right? They have a
Right.
direct supervisor, somebody they work for. And as you well know, with your union experience, sometimes there are tensions that arise in those relationships, the power
Mhm.
relationship, or even the balance. So how does that work in your case as far as, I mean, do you have a considerable autonomy as far as how you do your work? Do you have somebody you have to report to? Do you have evaluation? Just how is that whole part of your job work?
Well, it is uh, okay. Technically, the woman I care for is my boss.
Mm, mhm,
And so the challenge is really on the consumer,
right.
uh, the person who consumes this service. But there is the Home Care Commission, which was set up a couple decades ago to represent as a collective the people who need care. And that Home Care Commission has put out a lot of guidelines and trainings for people who receive care to be able to be a boss. The, the, the fine detail of what that means is something that I've just come up against in the immediate year, because on one hand, you go into service for a person and you say, what do you need from me? These are the things that the state says you need. That's why you're receiving my service. That's why I'm getting paid to give you these things. But how do you want me to give them to you? So the first step is that process of qualification for the consumer, but the, then the caregiver gets this list. In the situation that I'm in, uh, we have three of us giving her care, um, but we also are the ones who help the state to figure out what she needs, because her guardian lives with us, and then the other two of us uh, are there to step in and perform work when necessary. So what that means is uh, she, uh, like I said, doesn't have the ability to say, this is how I want you to do that part of my job, and do this for me. And she doesn't have the capacity to track people's hours, which is the key thing that the consumers are responsible for.
Right.
And that's what I ran up against, because there are limits the state has imposed on how many hours in a month we can work,
Mhm.
regardless of what the need is. And that's counterintuitive. So, uh, but the person who's supposed to manage those limits and keep an eye on those limits is the consumer. And so we kind of discovered this. Um, that created some conflict between us and not our boss, real boss, but the state or the county. So, in understanding that that's the key thing she's responsible for, okay, now we can say to her guardian, now you have to take this on and we all will figure it out. So there's that much autonomy that's specific to the individual caregiving situation.
Do you and the other folks then, are you kind of an informal care or a care team, as it were? I mean, do you all discuss as a group what's going on and how to adapt or change, or just, just making this circumstance as good as it can be?
Absolutely, absolutely. And we're this family unit. And so this task that we've all taken on is bringing us together and educating us about each other. And so we kind of are the managers. I mean, there have been times, and we also are fortunate that we can hire at least one other person to come in and work. And that's who I call the outside caregiver. But here you have the situation where they come in and they're approaching this situation professionally, and of course they need to learn the layout of everything. So as family members, even though I'm not working, I'm barraged with questions. How do you do this? What do you want? What's for the dinner? And where, all this stuff, because the consumer can't answer those questions.
Right. Sure.
So, but we do act as a team. We're fortunate that way.
Yeah. And without, if this gets too personal, just say so. But I guess what I'm curious about is that, even in the best of family circumstances, there's history in terms of how people interact with each other. And, there can be tensions, sometimes long or deeply rooted. I'm just curious if you're, if this isn't too personal, just in terms of navigating the family dynamic as far as this
Yeah.
task. Because it's one thing to be doing it, I would assume, with people like the outside person or somebody you don't have that history with, but then you've got this whole other set of dynamics, I would assume, that have to be navigated.
Well, you really hit the nail on the head, and I would say that's been the most challenging thing for me, because, for example, people who have raised this young woman or known her have certain patterns of communicating, or and pattern is really important. Pattern of our lives is really important. It's what we depend on. But other people, so how I have navigated, well, we've all navigated this, and there have been times when our attitudes really butt up against each other, and we go to the resources that we have, and we individually and personally and spiritually and emotionally to find a way through that. And that's where I've finally characterized the challenges to experience humility, that you don't know everything, willingness to be wrong, a willingness to trust that somebody else is either right or going to be okay until you figure it out. So that kind of mutual appreciation, I would call it. I think that's what's making me so happy, because I see it.
Mm.
I see the evidence of it, and there were times I didn't think it was possible. So absolutely, there's that conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
And a few more things, Jennifer. Just as far as you've done caregiving for a fairly lengthy period of time, are there any changes you've noticed just in the work, whether it's as far as things that you've learned, or are there any things in terms of equipment or tools or technology, just any things, or even just the way the work is done as far as the overall administrative aspects of it in terms of dealing with the state, just any changes you've seen in terms of the evolution of your job and how you do it over the time you've been doing it?
There are. I mean, you might not think there are, and being it's all in the home and whatnot, but there are. And one of them has been that this use of technology and web-based applications that the state wants us to use, because to track time and even to submit questions, to get feedback. It's all web-based. You can't really call the office anymore and just get an answer. So that's been a challenge for me, but a big change, I think, for the industry itself. And another big change has been that there was a time up till about, I think, 2014, when the state just didn't have the resources to provide the real services that people needed. And I will mention that many people in like my great niece had been institutionalized until the until the hospital in Salem was shut down. So that's when community-based services began. And there was a need for caregivers to open up adult foster homes or group homes, or go into someone's home and provide care, or for family members to be able to care for their loved ones. And dramatic changes have happened since then. So when the state began to get enough resources to actually provide adequate care, I think we've seen a lot of improvement. And those resources are what makes it possible for my great niece to enjoy a life, whereas frankly, she'd be a whole different person without it. Changes also, a lot of those, what I just described also has brought awareness to the greater community and more acceptance and more opportunities. So many people can get into job training, can get jobs in the local area, and can have programs like bowling. My great niece wouldn't be able to hold a job of any type, but because there is now an opening and maybe an addition to our industry of that service, and people who, you know, can provide that training and provide the job and make contacts to encourage people to hire folks. All of that is a whole new thing in the industry. And I've seen a lot of, a lot of that has changed just since we've been providing care at home.
You kind of anticipated actually another question I had, which is alluded a little bit to this, which is if there were, I don't know, maybe one thing or even more than one thing, what should people know about caregiving that you think they probably don't know? Or what would you like for them to know about caregiving, maybe phrase it this way, that they perhaps don't know or aren't aware of?
Well, it's incredibly important, for one thing. It's essential. More people do it than anyone might imagine. At some point, you're going to do it. And at some point, you're going to need it. So I think the most important thing for people to understand is it's not a big deal. It's yeah, so it's not a big deal. But it really needs to be recognized. You have to be able to say to yourself, I'm caregiving, instead of just, I'm cooking dinner for my husband or whatever, you know. You have to be willing to recognize that the people, if you're in a whole different industry or just walking down the street, caregiving is really a universal experience. And to pretend that it's so universal that just everybody does it, and therefore it doesn't need to be acknowledged as anything in and of itself. So I would want people to acknowledge it as an important and essential thing in our lives. And then the necessity for some people to be paid for doing it, because it is work. And it is work that all the questions you've asked me needs training. It needs skill. It needs personal commitment, awareness, willingness to change and learn and grow. All of those things I think are really key for people in in our area and in life to understand and acknowledge and be willing to accept.
Great. So is there anything that we haven't covered that you would like to add or talk about? We've gone through quite a few things, but I wanted to give you an opportunity if there's something else as far as the work or your take on it that you would like to add before we conclude.
I think that's spelled WHEW. Yeah, so like I said, I really am very happy I'm doing this work. I'm very happy I can be paid for the work that I'm doing. I'm very happy that I can uh, support so I get to support myself, um, and so I'm very happy about many things. And I kind of hadn't gotten in touch with that except for this interview you wanted to do with me. And so I really appreciate that you asked me to be part of this. It gave me a lot of time to reassess uh, and I discovered things I hadn't realized were true for me.
Oh, well, that's great. Well, I think oftentimes and particularly I think in your work, you're doing it. It's not like you sit there and reflect on, oh, what does this mean? What's it all about? I don't, and I think that's one of the things about this project that excites us is really trying to honor and recognize the important work that people do in various types of occupations in Springfield, and to have them actually do some reflection that they maybe haven't had time to do or weren't asked about, so that we can have this overall broader understanding and appreciation of, as you say, well, I know essential work is a term that's kind of come into vogue. I sort of chuckle at it because, well, ironically, because I've always thought that all work was essential.
Yes, exactly.
And it seems like societies, it had to take a COVID-19 pandemic to make that realization spread a little more widely.
Right.
But okay, it's a day late and more than $1 short, but at least it's happening. So I think,
Right.
a positive thing. So, yeah.
I would also like to say that's exactly what I was thinking as well. Well, everybody's work is essential, and it's that quality of ignoring the essential that we need to kind of dismiss and start to uh, respect one another in a different way, because it's like now after the COVID, and I go to a store anytime I go out and interact with people, because we were so isolated. I had felt I couldn't do that anymore. I couldn't interact with people, not because people weren't around to interact, but I was fumbling. And but now when I do it, it's just joyful. I am so happy. I meet people in line or at the store in the checkout, and I and they just relate to, and it's a whole new experience of interacting with someone while we're all working together in our own job,
Mm.
really. So yeah, I would advocate everybody go through that and open themselves up to that experience instead of rushing through.
Yeah, Barack Obama had an interesting comment a while back. He said that it was about a recognition of our interdependency, and that our society and our democracy work better when we understood that and acted on that awareness. And I think caregiving is certainly a place where that happens in big font. You know, that's what you all do.
Yeah, yeah, it's like driving a car, all the little pieces have to work together or you don't get to go anywhere.
That's really true. That's so true. Well, listen, Jennifer, I want to thank you so much for taking time to speak with us, and we're really glad that we're the first interview associated with this project.
Oh, wow. Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I like